All right, today we will find ourselves in Chapter 2, Lesson 2, which is dealing with how economic systems help society deal with the fundamental problem of scarcity. Start off here, let's get some review questions in. What are the three main types of economies? And what are the difference between the three? By the end of the lesson, we're going to have a little bit of reflection on that. But the book likes to categorize the economies as traditional, market, and command, or socialist economies. But in the real world, it's not so orderly. It's really hard to actually classify what it is we're actually looking at. Mixed economies are the most readily available. There's so much overlapping, it's really hard to say what type is the predominant part of each country. Governments, markets, and traditional work, they together decide what, how, and for whom to produce. There's so much overlapping that sometimes it's hard to say what kind of economy it is. When we look back, we know why these mixed economies exist. It's because tradition and command markets are great for descriptions, but the world is so much more complex. A perfect example is actually in 1929 with the rise of Stalin in Russia. After the Communist Revolution, in the middle of World War I, you saw communism rise because the government took over the markets and said, this is what you need to produce, this is when you need to produce, and this is how much you have to produce. Until 1991, it was a strong model for what a socialistic economy was. But after the collapse, so many different changes were there, the model kind of evaporated. So a lot of these other small countries that were following the way of socialism and communism, these emerging countries tried to create their own version of what existed when Stalin and Russia were successful. In the United States, before the Great Depression, which was the worst period of economic decline in United States history, it lasted from 1929 to 1939, the United States had become a powerful industrial economy based off of a totally free market. Conditions were so harsh in the 1930s that a number of non-free market programs were created, including unemployment insurance, the minimum wage, Social Security, price supports in agriculture, and even bank deposit insurance. Example of a predominantly capitalistic market evolving into a mixed economy market. An evolution that took place because a democratic political system allowed for those demands and changes because we needed to change the way things were going. After this section, after this lecture, I'm going to take you to this link to show you about how Franklin D. Roosevelt and that New Deal era changed the way our economy and our government worked up to and including now. So when you look at the shared characteristics of a mixed economy, I thought that this was the best chart to show you where we were. It's kind of a teeter-totter. It's a balancing act between the free market and government interventions. In a free market, entrepreneurs are able to make profit, freedom to set up their own types of business, prices are going to be determined by market forces, and there's private ownership of business. On the right side, you see the government intervention. What is the role in a mixed economy of the government? And they create progressive tax to reduce inequality, meaning that every person is going to be able to survive or strive in the system, meaning that if you're born poor, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to die poor. They create government regulations to help companies stay in check, meaning what is the best thing that we could do? If a company's polluting, how do we stop them from doing that whenever people don't have the power themselves to do it? There's going to be taxes on goods and government provisions of public goods, meaning all the regulations that are in check. Look at the different industries that are regulated. You have the prices of milk, you have the prices of cigarettes, you have the prices of alcohol, all regulated through the government to make sure that things are competitive, or that we could create an industry where the government doesn't have to set up and bail out or buy out every part of it. There's also an allocation or distribution by self-directed individualisms in socialism, communism, and mixed socialism. The first example when you're talking about this is perhaps the most distinguishing feature of a market or capitalistic economy is the private ownership of productive resources and the freedom to use them as however the owner sees fit. In this system, the allocation of the resources happens in an entirety in the free market comprised of self-directed individuals, meaning that each of us has the ability to create our own industry, create our own business as long as we follow the regulations that are set aside by the government in order to help protect people. Under socialism, private individuals own some of the production resources while the government owns the uses of the rest. The extent of the government-owned resources varies from one socialist country to the next, with the most socialistic countries being the ones that have the most government ownership of resources. For example, that Soviet Union that I talked about, none of the resources were privately owned because the government owned them all. Communist economies, for instance, too, the philosophy was first laid out by an economist and a historian who we're going to be talking about soon in the next lesson. His name is Karl Marx. Marx viewed all history as a class struggle between the workers and the property owners. A struggle that would lead to the alternating periods of depression, such as the one we had in the United States in the 1930s, to periods of prosperity. Marx thought that the working class would eventually rise up and overthrow the property owners. Society would then eventually reach a theoretical idealism called communism. Communism is an economic and political system in which factors of production are collectively owned and directed by the state. Classless societies exist in which everyone's working conditions are working for a common good or a common strength. And finally, you have socialism. And according to Karl Marx again, you had a socialism as a stage of economic and political system necessary for a country to reach the ideal of communism. Under socialism, the government owns and controls some, but not all of the bases of production. In most societies, socialist societies and economies, the government provides some of the basic needs to its people, such as education, jobs, transportation, and healthcare. So if you look at the United States, you could say that ideas of socialism are already here. They're growing when you see a liberal left trying to push on some of these socialist ideals. But when we have healthcare, when we have Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, those are socialistic ideas. You sitting in high school right now, being required and paid for by the government with your tax dollars. That is truly socialism. And the final part to say this is when you're talking about this socialism and the mixed socialism, Venezuela in South America is a perfect example. It took a dramatic turn towards socialism when Hugo Chavez became the president back in 1999. He embarked on a policy of land and wealth redistribution, along with the nationalization of domestic and multinational corporations. Firms that were nationalized include telephone, electric utilities, leading steel companies, food processing plants, and even banks. Most of the nationalization was either done by confiscating or purchasing firms from their former owners. President Chavez died in 2013 before the total nationalization was complete, leaving an economy that had that mixture of socialism, capitalism, and tradition. So when you look at it, when you say the whole idea, Russia was a communist state that has now turned into a mixed economy. The United States was a free market capitalistic state that is now considered a mixed economy, mostly capitalist. Okay? And then you have countries like Venezuela. We're going to do a little bit of research to figure out what are the predominant characteristics that we see of each of these countries, why are some of them our allies, and some of them we don't like to interact with as much. We'll continue this lecture in the next section.